Hello, everybody! Welcome to the first official two-segment episode of the Warp Sci podcast. I'm Coffee.
And I'm Macaron. Today we'll be discussing what if schools hadn't changed since 1985 and the evolution of scientific education.
What a short intro. Alright, let's get into the what if. What if schools, high schools, had not changed since 1985?
Well, first of all, the lack of change that would stand out very much is just the technology, the difference in technology. Well, basically we didn't have a lot of modern technology that we do now. We wouldn't have smart boards. I mean, some schools still don't have smart boards, but we wouldn't have those smartboards that we would have chalkboards, not even whiteboards. Some people would still have chalkboards, and it would not even. And I think it was only in the 1990s where computer labs existed. Like they went into the library to access the computer, and there might have been 0 to 1 computers in their household. So no home, like barely any homework could be done on no homework would be done on your laptop, and you'd only need a laptop if there's a computer lab, a high-tech computer lab in your school, and you're an advanced school. You have a room with a bunch of computers, very, very bulky computers sitting on desks. So
Yeah, I think a second point that really stood out to me personally, because I'm currently in high school and I obsessed way too much over college admissions, but college applications and college admissions and the stuff you do to prepare for college seems a lot different back in 1985. And honestly, I think this applies to most of the 1980s. 1985 is just an arbitrary year, but according to some accounts that I read online, uh, there weren't any APs or there were very few, and no one had heard of the IB program, which is very different from today where everyone's like, oh, you gotta have 10 plus APs if you want to show colleges that you can handle the college coursework. And going along with what you said about the lack of technology, well, not technology in general, but computers and stuff, like it shocks me very much when somebody said that you had to write your college applications by hand and literally nail them.
oh my
Like,
God, imagine writing out your college essays by hand and
uh,
mailing them. Jeez.
yeah,
And yeah, basically, you know how you said that there were very few AP classes, and it was very interesting that way because AP classes are standardized all over the nation, and yeah, like teachers, your teacher might be better than another school's AP history teacher, but it wasn't there wasn't that much standardized education back then. It was very state or district dependent, and there probably what I've read online, there were honors classes and there were higher level classes, but they were all school dependent. So a high level math class in one city might be very different looking from a high level class in another city. So it was hard for colleges to tell the difference and how much the student could actually do in a certain subject because higher level classes were also very dependent on the school, and it's basically impossible for colleges to know how each class is structured in every school. And talking about continuing about colleges, getting into college was way more quantitative than it was qualitative any back then because you didn't have like they relied more on your test scores, your GPA, and all of that. Whereas nowadays we're leaning more to a holistic approach, which I personally think is a much better approach, right? Because yeah, tests are important. It's good for a benchmark thing. Like obviously, if you get a 600 SAT, they're gonna kick you. They're not gonna accept you. Okay, Stanford's not gonna accept you if you have an extremely low SAT score. But I feel like now, if you get a certain point and above, they'll just accept you. and it's more of a they won't accept you, but you'll pass that test benchmark, and then they'll look at all your extracurriculars and your essays and who you are as a person. Back then, that wasn't really a thing. They mainly went off of your SAT score, your GPA, which again is dependent on your school. So it was very, very different, and you had to be more careful in picking your school and all of that back then. So
This is just turning into 21st century high schoolers judging 20th century high schools. I'm not entirely sure about like how much pressure there was in high schools back then compared to now, because initially my impression was that there was less pressure, like because colleges were less competitive, but like I think um it would have been sort of harder if it was so like district dependent and nothing was that standardized.
yeah, I think that pressure it was pressure in a different sense. I think in those days, parents pushed kids more to actually get a job that will pay well rather than something that you will like. Um, in even in cultures that today focus more on passion than money. But I think that back then it was get a job that pays well, and it was not as much of how happy you will be in that job. I mean, it definitely depended on some families, but the majority of people that I see, especially in countries that weren't America, also it was definitely like Asian countries, definitely. Parents really pressured kids to find a job that will pay well. So it was either like an engineer or a doctor, you know. You pick something that is respected and pays well. And it doesn't matter if you like it. If you're respected and you have money, of course you'll like it, right? So it was more that type of mindset. Whereas now I feel with social media and the internet, you can make money from practically any profession now. I mean, of course, there still are ranges, but you can definitely make a living from many, many professions. If you get an English degree, it's the only job for you isn't just a teacher or maybe a writer if you get successful. You can blog, you can help, you can tutor in different ways like on the internet. You can have a YouTube channel. If you do like a filmography or whatever it's called, you can run other people's YouTube channels. You can film for them. You can edit different things on the internet, whereas filmography was only thought you could only do go into the film industry, whereas that's not the case anymore. There are so many more jobs out there in which you can make a living from different degrees at this point. So the pressure was different. Now it's like we have so many choices, and the pressure is to choose one that you will love. Like, what if I don't choose one that I'll love? Then I'll have to restart, right? From again and again and again until I find something that I like. So and then it's not just you okay, how do I say this? Back then, you had to focus on your test scores more, like I said. So if you weren't a good test taker, it was like, okay, then that sucks for you. People who do have great scores will get into colleges and you won't, even if you are a good student. But now I feel like we have more of a chance to show, okay, I'm not the best test taker, but I do have a pretty good GPA and I have stunning extracurriculars, you see. So colleges didn't really look at that, didn't have that holistic approach. So the pressure was different for high schoolers then.
Yeah, so it seems like there's a lot more opportunities, I guess, for high schoolers today. Like back then, you obviously couldn't be a. It was probably very unheard of to have a podcast in high school like we do. Yes, but I think the social. We've been talking a lot about academics, but like I think the social scene was also very different. Like back in 1985, there was a lot more racism and homophobia, and like mental health wasn't really talked about. There wasn't as much awareness as there is today, I guess. And I think teen alcohol use was also much more common. And like there seems to be like some very clear social divisions within like the student body. Like I was reading like accounts, like people's like first-hand stories, and like a lot of them were like talking about these groups within like that were called like nerds, jocks, like prep stoners, like and whatever.
I think that I think those things are still there, except in an online community. Like, you'll see divisions on the internet for people to you'll see divisions on the internet like StudyGram and StudyTube for the nerds and the people who love stationery and blah blah blah. But then there's also people like the gamer side of YouTube where people stream on Twitch and do all of stream games on Twitch. There's that side of the internet. And there's I think all of the cliques that existed in person in school have just migrated onto the internet, and that's where people used to get bullied in school now happens on the internet. You'll go onto these spaces for certain people, certain groups of people where they're just enjoying their life, but some troll will come on and start bullying them, right? I think all that happens on the internet now, so I feel like it's not very school based. And I still think that there's some divisions, like people in an advanced program. We were in an advanced program in elementary and middle school, and I don't know if you noticed, but I remember that there is such a strong division in elementary school, especially, and even in middle school, between the people who are in the advanced program versus people who are in just the general program. And I find that so annoying. I feel like it's getting much better in seventh and eighth grade. It got much better, in my opinion. But people kind of, some people thought, some of the advanced people thought that they were higher than the people who weren't in the advanced program. Because of that, we used to get bullied in elementary school because we were in the advanced program. And now I feel like it's the opposite way because in this day and age, being a nerd is kind of cool because we're the ones who end up going into really high, like, into really well-paying jobs, into really cool, and like we get to do cool, innovative things. Like, we're in that stereotype now. It's like these cliques have migrated into a different sense. It's not as much the preps and the jocks and the nerds and the stoners or whatever. It's like a different, yeah, it's in a different space now. Class to class, like subject to subject, it's changed a lot. For example, like calculators weren't allowed in a lot of math classes, and what was taught in some classes was also a controversy, especially science. Number of an even bigger percentage of people thought that evolution shouldn't be taught in schools, which is we have an entire episode on that. But a lot of these things were a controversy. And that brings us to our next topic, our history of science topic, which today we're going to go over the history of scientific education.
We're gonna be talking about science as more like modern science, like not like alchemy or like philosophy or whatever, because that's like a whole another topic. But what we're gonna cover is from like the 1800s to the present. So starting from the before the mid 1800s, basically before the mid 1800s, science and science education was conducted in a very unstructured manner, like it wasn't standardized. But then in 1892, the National Education Association formed a committee of 10 on secondary school studies, and they like outlined goals for secondary education in general, because more people were enrolling in high schools. I mean, not high schools, but secondary education. Too much high school talk. Goals of secondary education included information about how to conduct scientific education, and the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s played a role in the standardization of science education, because like with the Industrial Revolution, you had a lot more technology, a lot more like uh people who are interested in improving these technologies. So, and to do that, you turn to science.
Yeah, so in 1889, the Harvard University descriptive list of elementary physical experiments, that's very long, but I said it. They published and provided a list of appropriate lab work for high school science classes, and this first set the national standards for science.
This lab work in science classes is going to become a very I don't want to say controversy. I'm not sure if it was a controversy, but like in later years, there was much debate and like change in standards around lab work, but we will get to that later. So the next important point era in scientific education was from 1900 to the end of World War II, and this is a very it was a turning point in science education because it got turned into a curriculum of just memorizing facts instead of gaining experiences. And this was kind of because the school administration wanted to like standardize literally everything, and it's much easier to have standards when your science is just facts. Like, yeah, everybody can compile some facts, and that's very easy to measure and standardize. And this standardization was described by John Dewey, who is famous for his progressive education ideas. In 1910, he said that science has been taught too much as an accumulation of ready-made material, which students are to be made familiar, not enough as a method of thinking, an attitude of mind after a pattern of which mental habits are to be transformed.
He's the guy who made the Dewey Decimal System too. Just to add that in
Oh
there, yeah.
yeah,
John
I did
Dewey.
not notice
Yeah.
that. Yes.
Fast forwarding to 1950, which is basically the end of World War II. The National Science Foundation was established, and its primary purpose was to support and promote just general and the basics of scientific research and education. And it was made of made of four main divisions. Number one was medical research, then mathematical, physical, and engineering sciences, then biological sciences, then scientific personnel and education.
Yeah, okay, so this National Science Foundation, the establishment of it was partially influenced by the Cold War and other global events, influenced by the federal government's desire to increase the quantity and quality of workers in the science slash technology field. And so, how this foundation worked was that it recruited a few elite scientists, and they by themselves would just create the whole like curriculum and develops the standardization. And during the 1950s, science class was still very like memorizing facts. It
Which
was
we
like
know is not a
memorizing
very good
vocab.
study technique. And I think that kind of carried on in, I think America tried to move away from it eventually earlier, but I feel like other countries didn't. From my experience, I was reading up on other countries' education, scientific education. I feel like for most other countries, especially in Europe and Asia, they still centered around this for a very long time. And I think only recently, or maybe never at all, like to this day, they're trying to move away from that now. I feel like they're realizing that this isn't a good idea. But yeah, there weren't any explanations to why these things are true, which is the main part of science, right? That's the whole point of science, to ask questions, ask why. Why is this happening, right? That is what science seeks to do, which makes no sense because why aren't these scientific textbooks encouraging this? Of course, not many people will go into science because all they think it is memorizing facts. Like no one wants to do that. And yeah, so things like lab work and scientific processes were way less important than actually memorizing these unchanging scientific knowledge, which we know scientific knowledge does change. So just memorizing these things creates a very set mindset for people. And it's proven that that's why generations which have done this in the past generally have a more closed mindset about changing science. So that's not a good thing. Yeah. And then in 1956, the Physical Science Study Community, or the PSSC, was formed. And basically, what this did was create science education where all students were supposed to basically, quote unquote, act like scientists and in a real and professional setting. And this was meant to integrate the scientific process and make students see what science really is in their by actually performing it by and doing lab work in science classes. And so the students would be more engaged in the class because practicing does help more students retain knowledge. And so in 1956 this was realized and they tried to implement this into more science classrooms. And then
Yeah, and also the curriculum of this committee really tried to emphasize that all scientific knowledge is based on evidence, and you can really see that still in current science education. Like, if you make a claim, you make a conclusion, they're gonna be like, okay, well, what is your evidence? Why is this true? And like that's like the questioning they want us to do, and that's the questioning that was not happening before when they were just memorizing facts from textbooks.
yeah, and then in 1958 Congress passed the National Defense Education Act to boost science education in response to the Soviet Union launching the very first satellite into orbit. And this was, as Poppy said, this was around the time of the Cold War. So we were in much competition with Russia, and this translated into scientific education because we're like, why isn't America doing the same things as the Soviet Union, right? We wanted to also, get into space, right? So we wanted better scientific education, and I feel like there was a definite push to create better scientific education. So this led Congress to pass this Defense Education Act. And then in the 1960s and the 70s, Robert Karplus and his science curriculum improvement at UC Berkeley established a learning cycle for science that is still used today. And this learning cycle, you probably recognize it a little bit at least. It's basically exploration, invention, discovery, and then repeat it. And this was mainly lecture based and more student centered inquiry approach. So students would ask questions, they would try to seek answers, and they'd maybe discover something. And this is kind of similar to what colleges usually do, but I feel like in high school you don't really do this as much. It's not implemented as much. I mean, speaking from my perspective as a 21st century high school student going into high school student. So,
Yeah, I think this approach was this learning cycle approach was really about like challenging students' preconceptions. I think this helped make people more open-minded. Like the exploration phase is like uh imposing your preconceptions onto this new concept and trying to make sense of it. And then invention was like um comparing your preconceptions with uh like what like new information. I'm kind of confused why it's called invention, but like and then discovery is like, coming out with new conceptions. I hope this sounds like what your song sounds like, but
I
but
think
yeah, it was
invention is
still
probably just like seeking solutions, like inventing solutions, probably.
yeah, like reconciling your preconceptions with the new information so everything makes sense.
Yeah, basically, right.
Yes. Okay, so then the next era, I guess, was the 1980s to the 1990s. And the main goal in these decades for science education, for reforming it, was to improve students' scientific literacy. So, what exactly does this improvement mean? Well, it means mainly improving three things. So, first, you want to increase student awareness and understanding of science. Second, you want to develop students' abilities to think scientifically and perform scientific inquiry. So, like the whole acting like a scientist thing. And thirdly, you want to allow students to actively participate in scientific education. What? Scientific investigation by using evidence, applying logic, constructing scientific arguments, and explanations for observations made during investigations. Wow, lots of Asians. Okay.
Nation, many nations. Okay, rambling.
So, going more in detail about the 1980s to 1990s, Macaron, do you want to take this?
By the way, find it so funny when teachers use the word scientific literacy in classrooms. You know, I remember one of our science teachers in 8th grade said like, "My goal here is to improve your scientific literacy," and I had to like stop myself from bursting out laughing because we had her in 7th grade too. She not once improved my scientific literacy. Okay, she just taught me how to read. Like I don't know some science. She probably didn't either. I'm probably giving her the benefit of the doubt. But yeah. Anyway, complete ramble. All right. In the early 1980s, a high school physics and chemistry teacher named Malcolm Wells reformed the learning cycle into the modeling cycle, where making models to explain scientific phenomenon became a fundamental concept in learning science. And making models has since then been proven multiple times in multiple studies to be an effective way to learn science and not just copying diagrams, which I think we can all be fall victim to when we take notes in science, just copying diagrams, but actually making models and being creative with it from the words you see in a textbook or making the models that are in the textbook into your own words. And this is something that has been proven and that Mr. Malcolm Wells promoted. Now, in 1987, to make science more engaging, a program once again at UC Berkeley, the best university, I'm totally not a sponsor, the UC Berkeley developed a curriculum with hands on and inquiry based approaches to exploring scientific issues that have a more direct impact on society, things like food safety and water pollution, things that will affect the environment, which will directly impact society. This kind of sounds like what Stanford would do, honestly. Stanford's very innovation based. But yeah, UC Berkeley in 1987 wanted to implement this, trying to show how science can affect the real world, which again is something that people are science teachers are trying to push in high school education a lot, trying to say that you can do something with this knowledge and it's not just memorizing facts like we said earlier. Yeah.
Okay, so that concludes our 20th century. history. So in the 2000s, we got a new goal for science education. Scientific education should prepare students for future scientific and technical jobs or other well paying jobs that could benefit from science knowledge. And you kind of see this reflected today where we have like all sorts of standards for like like schools mission statements. They're like preparing every student for the future workplace. Like I think this is sort of a
Oh my god.
widespread
And it
thing.
literally depends on which workplace you go into, but they're like, no, 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 the workplace, right? Because we love the workplace. We want to send all of you into the workplace. Like they know a thing about workplace. Literally, some teachers. Okay, continue.
Well,
I can rant about how teachers know nothing about the workplace for so long. Okay.
well, in but unfortunately, this new goal was kind of ironic because in 2001, science education was kind of put on the back burner as the No Child Left Behind Act was passed. This act um made teachers like scramble to improve their students' math and reading test scores because now like school funding is all based on that. And scientific education was really neglected in elementary schools. And personally, I think I have experienced this
Oh my
back in
god, same.
elementary school. Like, literally, all I learned was like rocks. Like, what?
I think they taught us waves in second grade, and I was so confused the entire time. All I knew what waves, all I thought about waves were these zigzaggy things, and I thought I was supposed to see them. They didn't even like teach me like what they even like actually were. It's so stupid. They were like, here's a lab, do it. No explanation, no nothing. How are we supposed to throw a lab at an 8-year-old and expect them to figure it out when you never even taught them anything about it? And this is when lab work comes in a controversial lens, you know?
Yeah, I think the problem today is not that we don't have lab work. It's not that like we put memorizing knowledge on a higher importance than lab work. It's just that we don't know. Like inherently a child does not know how to like actively investigate science stuff. I forgot the exact phrasing, but like I think the problem today is that yes, we have like the labs in the curriculum, but like the students are not comprehending it, which totally defeats the purpose of having the lab in the first place.
Exactly. Oh,
I also heard, I think my family like uh told me stories about science classes in China where they did labs, and like I heard that the labs weren't really about like acting like scientists or like really implementing the thinking processes or whatever that scientists go through. Like the purpose of doing the lab, like what they got out of the lab was like a chemical formula to memorize or like some lab equipment to memorize. Like I looked at the chemistry textbook and there was just like so much to memorize. And like I go to school in America obviously, and like my family was like, "You don't memorize this?" And I'm like, "No." It's like, why would you memorize what this obscure contraption is called when it's totally irrelevant to the lab?
exactly. Like you need to sometimes I bet this was the case in the mid 1900s and the late 1900s, especially when the lab work became more incorporated into the curriculum. I bet that they made you just memorize what was being used in the lab work more than what was happening in the lab. And honestly, I think that even in the labs that we've experienced throughout middle school that that's the case, and they won't even teach you properly, like, what's happening in the darn lab. But no, 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 you have to memorize it because it's gonna be on the claimed evidence and reasoning. So,
Not that trauma. Literally after every single lab they ask you to write this like paragraph. I don't understand because I don't think that's how they actually write research papers.
it's so dumb. They don't even, like, make you practice writing abstracts, like, what you would actually write in a scientific
Yeah.
paper, or conclusions in which a lot of people struggle with that I know, even in English essays that you're often taught about the beginning and the middle, but you're never taught about the end, which I feel is just something which is a common theme in education. You're always taught a few parts of the thing, but never the whole and never the ending. So we always look forward to the ending because we think it's a mystery and we think it's so fascinating. But it's kinda not. They need to teach us what exactly a scientific paper looks like. I didn't even know it until I actually read one for the first time. I'm like, "It's not a CER? It's not a claim evidence and reasoning? Like, what?" I read that, like, a year ago, and I was like, "The heck? This is not how scientific papers are structured?" And I'm gonna be very disappointed if this whole CER thing carries on to high school. I'll be very disappointed. Ugh.
Yes, that was a lovely tangent. But we're almost done here. The last point we have in history is 2018. And in 2018, most scientific standards in like most states in the United States, that was a lot of states in a row, but are consistent with a model that emphasizes three types of scientific knowledge. First, scientific content, which is like I'm assuming stuff you can learn in a textbook, and second, practices that you need for conducting scientific investigation, and third, you have engineering design. And the whole point of this model is to get students to use investigation to learn more knowledge and skills about concepts beyond the classroom. So this kind of goes back to the I think it's the UC Berkeley program back in the 1900s where they tried to make science more relevant, and we're still doing that. So don't know. Well, I guess it works. It's helpful when you can see how what you're learning makes an impact on your life. Because if it doesn't, then you get stuff like math anxiety, like we discussed in the previous episode.
Yeah.
But, anyways, the end. Wow. We hope you liked the new structure of our podcast. And if you have other feedback, please share in the YouTube comments.
Feedback is always greatly appreciated, except for when it's bad mic feedback, because we know. Keep the comments to yourself. We know when it's bad. We know. Okay? But anyways, that concludes our episode. So have a good life.